Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. And welcome to this panel session on fostering cooperation among relevant UN bodies to advance small-scale fisheries human rights in the face of climate change. I would like you to thank you for participating in this panel session. And this panel session is organized by the One Ocean Hub and its partners. The One Ocean Hub is an international program of research for sustainable development, working to promote fair and inclusive decision-making for a healthy ocean whereby people and planet flourish. The hub brings together coastal people, researchers, decision makers, civil society, and international organizations to value and learn from different knowledge and voices. The One Ocean Hub is funded by the United Kingdom Research and Innovation through the Global Challenges Research Fund, and it is a key component in delivering UK aid and strategy to tackle sustainable development goals. I will be moderating today's session. My name is Bolanle Emiosho. I am a lawyer and researcher with the Faculty of Law at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, as well as the University of Derby Law School. I am also co-director for Ghana on the One Ocean Hub, and I research on plural legal systems for ocean governance and human rights-based approaches to protecting small-scale fisheries. To start off today, just a few housekeeping rules. Please introduce yourself in the chat space. And of course, any questions you have can be included in the question and answer space. We will keep an eye on these and we would either answer the questions in the space or live at the end of the session. And so now to the main business of this panel. We will first start with a screening of a short animation film which has been prepared by the One Ocean Hub titled The Protectors of the Ocean.
All life on Earth is dependent on the ocean, but all too often, the people who are most connected to the ocean have no say in the decisions being made. Small-scale fishers in particular experience many injustices, both social and environmental, and their rights are often not recognised. One Ocean Hub uses inclusive research processes to support the human rights of small-scale fishers so they can participate in decision-making that affects their lives, livelihoods and culture, all of which are linked to a healthy ocean.
I am Hilda Adams, 64-year-old small-scale fisherwoman living in a small town, Marmarie, grown in a fisher family, and I am a third-generation fisherwoman. My son is a fisherman, and my grandson of only 7 years old is dreaming to become a fisherman. We say that we are essential to our livelihoods, to protect it and to sustain it for future generations. We say that we are essential to ocean protection. We are using low impact gear or even no impact gear with certain species, and we have been practicing sustainable harvesting all our lives.
One Ocean Hub partners with UN agencies to better understand how the views, needs and knowledges of Indigenous and local communities can be amplified and included in ocean decision-making. We build new bridges between UN bodies and small-scale fishers, together with researchers, governments and other partners in Ghana, Namibia and South Africa.
It cannot go on for another 5 years. We are giving our inputs, we set round tables, we share our knowledge, our experience, we share our information. We contribute positively to food security, to food sovereignty, and we have huge potential to contribute more effectively with better and appropriate legislation.
Small-scale fishers are considered to be protectors of the sea everywhere in the world. They have been here for a very long time, and here they should stay.
Thank you, Senia, for that. And I believe that short film actually is a fantastic way to start our discussions this morning around, or this afternoon or evening, wherever you are actually, around some of the pressing concerns we will be discussing today on the challenges of small-scale fishers in light of climate change. To start us off, the first presentation this morning, we'll be examining co-production of solutions with small-scale fishers as a way to ensure inclusive ocean climate action. And this presentation is a joint presentation by Dr. Pilile Mbata, Dr. Tapiwa Warikwanda, and myself, Dr. Bolanle Ariosho. Dr. Tapiwa Warikwanda holds postgraduate and undergraduate and postgraduate law degrees from the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. He's at the University of Namibia School of Law, where he teaches as a senior lecturer. He has particular expertise in several areas, including constitutional law, mining law, legal anthropology, as well as labor law and international trade law. He has edited numerous books and published articles on these areas, and he's a co-investigator on the One Ocean Hub in Namibia. Dr. Pilile Mbata is with the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Pilile is interested in the broader themes of environmental governance, sustainable livelihoods, and marine resources. And she is, of course, passionate about influencing decision-making processes about the environment and natural resources. Her research focuses on bridging the gap between natural resource governance and livelihoods of marginalized people in the global South through linking marine and coastal resource governance debates to debates about history, about power, and sustainable livelihood. She's involved in policy processes that facilitate dialogue between policymakers. She's also involved in various transdisciplinary projects focusing on small-scale fisheries governance, including UNESCO World Heritage Site governance, coastal conflicts, climate change, and a critique of the blue economy. I will be joining these two colleagues, Pilile and Tapiwa, to present on co-production of solutions with small-scale fishers as a way to ensure inclusive ocean climate action. Pilile, would you like to start? I will share the slides first.
Yes, thank you, Paula, and hello, everybody. Okay, thank you so much, Paula, and greetings, everybody. As introduced, my name is Pilile Mbata, and today we'll be talking about the co-production of solutions with small-scale fishers as a way to ensure inclusive ocean climate action. Some of this presentation also draws on some of the areas that we work in within this country context, such as in South Africa, in Cape Town, as well as in Namibia, and also in Ghana in the Cape Coast. You can move to the next slide, Paula. So as Paula has mentioned, as part of this team in this presentation, we all have a lot of experience working with small-scale fishers, and a lot of the knowledge that we have about small-scale fisheries and small-scale fishers comes from the day-to-day engagements we have with them through our research. And more we've realized, and this is also something that is highlighted in the literature, that fishing for many small-scale fishers is not just an occupation for income or something that they do to put food on the table. Yes, that is also important, but also in the literature, there are pointers made about small-scale fisheries being an occupation of last resort, when in fact, the deeper realization that we want to highlight here is that small-scale fisheries is a way of life for many small-scale fishers, which forms part of their identities that are rooted in their local histories, traditions, and customs. So it is important to note, however, within the context of this conference, that small-scale fishing communities and their livelihoods are vulnerable, and they find themselves vulnerable for many reasons and because of various factors. And over and above climate change being increasingly a factor that impacts the livelihoods of small-scale fishers, other factors that are impacting their ability to engage in their small-scale fishing livelihoods include lack of recognition of bona fide rights to fishing, lack of access rights to land and resources, lack of participation and inclusion or even representation in decision-making processes about small-scale fisheries governance, as well as conservation governance related to small-scale fisheries, as well as poor small-scale fisheries governance. A lot of these issues have been identified within the African continent and in various parts of the global south. And surprisingly, also in parts of the global north, where small-scale fishers also find themselves marginalized in the fisheries sector. So these are some of the challenges that small-scale fishers deal with on a day-to-day basis. And climate change then becomes an added stressor to their livelihoods over and above these issues that we also want to highlight. You can move to the next slide. So climate-related changes that have been observed, especially in the Southern African context, include sea level rise, increased tidal inundation, as well as flood frequency, as well as acceleration of erosion, among other factors. So increasingly, small-scale fishers are perceiving a lot of these climate-related changes because they impact their ability to fish. And many of them go to sea every day, which is why they've been able to perceive a lot of these changes over a period of time. And as you will see in my next slide, which I'll come to just now, we have actually undertaken research in the South African continent, in the South African context, where we've looked at the perceptions of small-scale fishers about climate change over the past few years, and also just trying to understand whether their perceptions match those of decision makers who usually draw their information about climate change that goes into policy making from experts and also scientific knowledge. So increasingly, we are realizing that there's a lot of knowledge about climate change and climate-related changes that small-scale fishers hold that we can tap into. So as I've mentioned earlier on, there are other stresses that are also impacting the ability of small-scale fisheries to engage in their activities over and above climate change. And one of the biggest one in the African continent is the rise of the blue economy. Blue economy activities include offshore oil and gas mining and explorations, coastal mining, aquaculture, tourism, among other sectoral activities. The increase in these activities, because of their identified contribution to the economies of coastal countries in the African continent, has resulted in the marginalization of the small-scale fisheries as a sector, but usually the trend that we've seen within the African continent is that in decision-making about these sectoral activities, small-scale fishers are always left behind. But then they are the ones that bear the impact of these activities, especially the cumulative impact of these activities on the coast, which is a big issue. And this is a trend that we're seeing, especially in South Africa. It's quite a big issue. So it is important to note, because having mentioned that, it is therefore important to recognize that small-scale fisheries or small-scale fishers do not exist in a vacuum, but they exist within complex socio-ecological systems. And within those complex socio-ecological systems, therefore, climate change coupled with anthropogenic induced changes, it threatens the coastal ecosystems and marine species through changes and alteration in the productivity, abundance, and distribution of marine species. And in turn, that has impact on the economic and social sustainability of the livelihoods of small-scale fishers, especially those that do not have alternative livelihoods and are mainly reliant on small-scale fishing for survival. Therefore, the intertwined relationship between coastal risk and vulnerability of small-scale fishing communities requires adaptation measures that are fit to context and that recognize how different small-scale fishers all over the world are not only faced with climate change, but with other factors that come with it that work differently in different contexts. Next slide. So I've decided to include a case study in South Africa in the Western Cape province in the south, just to demonstrate an example of how small-scale fishers are actually perceiving impacts from climate change, which are having an impact on their fishing activities. So this particular case study is from a study that was done by one of my master's students in a community called Bafeljakspar, which is in the Western Cape. And in this study, she was trying to look at what are the perceptions of small-scale fishers about climate change, and have those been recognized by scientists and decision makers that are making decisions and implementing policies about climate change. So this particular slide shows the different livelihood strategies of the community that are based on small-scale fishing, and it shows also how women and men and women within these communities they play similar roles within this community. They play similar and different roles in relation to small-scale fishing, with women being mostly involved in the post-harvest activities, as well as in the harvest of intertidal resources, whereas men are mainly involved in land fishing activities. Just click enter, Paula. So in this study, we were trying to understand the perceptions of local small-scale fishers about climate change over the period of time. So we asked them to identify a period when they felt that climate change was increasingly having an impact on their livelihoods. And various small-scale fishers in this community pointed that since the 2000s, they've noticed significant changes in the oceans, especially in relation to rougher seas as well as winds that are impacting their ability to go to fish every day. And as you saw in the video that we screened before the presentation, a lot of small-scale fishers in South Africa use very low technology gear to fish, which means that if seas are rough and if the winds are rough, they're not able to go to sea like other parts of the fishery sector. So this timeline demonstrates how over time, impacts of climate change are inhibiting their ability to fish. Can you press enter? And then lastly, this basically shows how these climate change impacts are affecting the community and their ability to fish. And on the right-hand side, the right-hand column, where it says coping mechanisms, this is an example of some of the mechanisms that they are applying to adapt, because they are very poor in, there are no interventions that exist that are assisting the small-scale fishers to cope with the impacts of climate change, because they don't really have a voice in decision-making about climate change in most cases. So whatever they are perceiving to be the impacts of climate change on the ground, the interventions to assist them with that have not really come through. So for instance, as you can see here, a lot of the fishers say that they look for alternative livelihoods when they are not able to go to sea because of climate change impacts, among other things that they are doing. But in many cases, there are no other options because this particular community relies heavily on small-scale fisheries. And some of the interventions that have tried to assist small-scale fishers in South Africa mostly come from non-governmental organizations. But from a government perspective, there's still a mismatch between what small-scale fishers are perceiving to be impacts that are very important, that need to be addressed to improve their livelihoods, and what is being decided and what is being the focus of governments around climate change. I'm going to now hand over to Tapiwa to talk about the Namibian context.
Thank you, Pidile. I think in the context of Namibia, before I talk about the slides, I'll just give a quick and brief outlook. It's important to note that Namibia is some of the most productive fishing grounds in the world, with yields of over 1.5 million metric tons, and that's crucial. But in as much as it has this kind of significant, productive fishing grounds, the SSF to date have not really benefited to the same. Of course, we have Hafer, the representative of whom is here, and we'll talk later, but with some limitations. While the country has got this productive fishing grounds, the country's economy is obviously dependent on the endowment on natural resources. So of course, you find out that there are related socioeconomic factors which include population growth, even high levels of poverty, lack of income, and lack of employment, worsening of vulnerability, particularly amongst the SSF, who also, in a sense, do contribute to the income of the livelihoods and food security in Namibia, both from an inland and a coastal perspective. So because of this, it's very important to be alert to the aspect of climate change. And we need to understand it from the context that Namibia's climate is variable. It's actually prone to so much change. And because of this variability, like I said, human livelihoods, jobs, cultural heritage, amongst other issues, can be adversely impacted by this particular climate change. And you need to appreciate also that Namibia's marine fisheries rely on the nutrient-rich upwelling of the Benguela Current, and which, of course, we have noted over time has been changing so much because of the effects of climate change. And what we have noticed over time since 1993 is the fact that these warmer seas that are coming up have already led to depletion of pilchard stocks, which are also a crucial component of the fisheries sector. And of course, climate change has impacts that are affecting fish catches. I think I would have loved, the clip for the heifer to actually be shown, because it actually depicts instances where there is no catch that is actually realized for over a period of 6 months in some instances because of the effects of climate change. And of course, because of the depletion of catches, there's also a decrease in production that ranges between 30 to 50%. And this does adversely impact on the SSF because some of them are heavily reliant on the small catches for their livelihood and sustenance. And take note that they are reliant in this particular context, but not necessarily with the element of inclusion or recognition by the legislation, because largely emphasis is on what we call recreational fishing. If anyone wants to actually be recognized for purposes of selling or trading in fish, they must actually be party to the heifer in that regard. So there are obviously notable impacts that are being realized on the coastal towns, and most specifically when we talk about Swakopmund, Walvis Bay, and Hentis Bay, where the heifer is based itself. So the effect of climate change on marine resources is obviously going to impact on Namibia's SSF, as already is being noticed. Next slide, Bola. Okay, so what is prompting this kind of pattern that we are realizing and noticing? I mentioned about the Benguela Current, and of course there are changes in the West Coast Ocean circulation, which is posing a threat to Namibia's marine fisheries. So the Benguela Current, like I mentioned, has a nutrient-rich upwellings, and of course these are likely to give, and they are crucial anyway to the fisheries. But because of the change in this pattern, we notice significant patterns of fisheries retreat. Certain species of fish are no longer accessible, amongst other things, and these would have an adverse impact, of course, on the SSF. So, of course, any change in the upwelling frequency, timing, or distribution will have an impact on production, and they have a big impact on the economy. And I need to emphasize that this will also have an impact on any efforts that are being made currently to include the SSF within the recognition framework of participating in the economic mainstream. You might need to note that, like I mentioned earlier, from a regulatory perspective, the SSF are not recognized in the regulatory framework. But of course, in the inland regulatory framework, we may find recognition. But in the mainstream coastal activities, they are not per se recognized. And we now have a national plan of action. Now, what would be the impact of this national plan of action if the effects of climate change are such that we have a significant depletion in marine resources, which may impact on the measures or policies that may be adopted towards inclusivity of this particular group of fisher communities who also have to benefit from the fisheries. So, of course, we noticed the decline in fish stocks, and which, of course, like I mentioned, are caused by a number of environmental variables, which include the climate change related global warming. So there is obviously a need to pay particular attention to climate change in Namibia. What has been done so far, there is a climate change policy that was adopted in Namibia, but of course there are not so many changes that have come up since its adoption in 2010. And so there's need to adapt quickly to understand the current demands and takes and changes that are aligned to climate change in the context of Namibia. So I think that's the part for Namibia. Paula.
Thank you, Tapiwa. So I'll just quickly run through what the hub is doing. I must say that the situation in Ghana mirrors what has been discussed so far. And essentially, what we will do at the later end of this panel session is to actually hear from a chief fisherman from one of the regions of Ghana that are most affected by climate change and tides. And what you would hear from his first-hand experience or description is the impacts not just on their economic welfare, but also on their cultural identities and even their spiritual connections to the ocean. And so certain historical or spiritual sacred places have been swallowed up by the ocean, etc. And so you will hear that. And so I won't dwell too much on the Ghana experience because the chief fisherman will, I think, quite clearly highlight that. But I should just say, just as in many parts of Africa, one of the big challenges for small-scale fishers is exclusion from decision-making and governance processes. And so for many small-scale fishing communities, in particular women fishers, they're unable to participate effectively in decision-making around the resources that they are reliant on and intimately connected with. So what then is the hub doing? I would just like to highlight very quickly, because we're running out of time, one of the things the hub is doing in that regard. So the hub is quite committed to what we call rights-based approaches to ocean governance and the use of human rights to help to transform ocean governance. It's particularly important approach because essentially at the core of it is the idea that development policies, law, legislation, etc., must address the needs of those facing exploitation, exclusion, and dispossession as small-scale fishers are. And of course, a consideration of a right-based approach would then lead to ideas around the right to participate, the right to information, and the right to culture. Is essentially the idea is to draw on existing human rights commitments, which there are quite a few of them. And thankfully for many African countries, these are not just rights which are adopted in international treaties and international law, but also rights which are often guaranteed in their constitutions, and see how those can be deployed to protect small-scale fishers within their context and within their communities. And so the recognition, for example, of protection of cultural rights links directly to the fact that small-scale fishers are have long histories of engagement in the communities and particularly along the coast, and their culture is quite intertwined with their activities as small-scale fishers, and even expressed within that culture is how they manage the ocean and how they manage the resources. And so inclusion of that, inclusion of those, the recognition of all of those aspects of their culture is also very relevant and important way to ensure that ocean governance is transformed in the context of small-scale fishers. And of course, the human rights approach also comes with an obligation on duty bearers such as states. And so it compels them to be able to take those measures. And that obligation means that there are obviously corresponding reporting obligations. There is potential for judicial interventions to address some of the challenges which small-scale fishers face. And what we'd also like to highlight, of course, and that's where we're particularly keen to have our partners the UN agencies who are our partners who are involved here, is there needs to be an advancement of that narrative, of that connection between small-scale fisheries, human rights, and state duties, and of course, how that works in the context of climate change. And that also needs to be reflected through international agreements, discussions around international agreements. And there needs to be quite clear clarification of the various international human rights mechanisms, particularly related to oceans and small-scale fisheries, and how those can help support compliance by states. And so these bodies need to make it much clearer and much easier for small-scale fishers to be able to perhaps approach them, to collaborate with them to monitor compliance on, by states of some of the obligations which states have signed up to. And of course, to do that, there must be capacity building. And that's one of the things the Hub is doing in a number of the places that we work. We're strengthening capacity of small-scale fishing communities to be able to participate in many of these high-level meetings, which sometimes they might feel excluded from, but also ensuring that their voices are quite heard. And that's one of the ways we do that is through some of the films which we have shown, and we have quite a number of them as well on our YouTube channel. And we also use a number of art-based methodologies. We're having a panel which specifically looks at some of the art-based methodologies which we use, which are excellent for stakeholder engagement across all the scales. And through the art, we're not only showcasing the culture, the history of these small-scale fishing communities, but we're creating platforms for them to be able to actually project their voice and quite clearly speak to their own challenges in the way which is best for them. What I'll do is I'll leave it here. And of course, if you look to our website, the World Ocean Hub, further information on some of our activities, you would find on the website. I'm sure Senia will put the link in the chat. Thank you very much. And I will stop the share here. Right. Yes. So following on from our presentation, we will quickly go on to the next presentation, which will be given by Miss Kate Cook, and she will be talking to us on defending small-scale fishers, the critical role of human rights in the era of climate emergency. Miss Kate Cook, yes, I can see that she's started to share the slide. Right, Miss Kate Cook is a barrister at Matrix Chambers in London. She has specialist and wide-ranging expertise in environmental law, public international law, and human rights law. And she has appeared as counsel before the International Court of Justice in cases relating to environmental issues and genocide. Her recent work includes acting for NGOs in domestic climate-related litigation and in relation to the United Kingdom's ongoing trade negotiations. She advises regularly on the climate emergency and fisheries and marine-related issues. And she's the co-author of Building Resilience to Climate Change and Disaster Risk for Small-Scale Fisheries Communities, which was published by the FAO in 2021. Ms. Kate Cook, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning or whatever time of day it is with participants. I'm very pleased to follow on from colleagues from One Ocean Hub because the issues that they have outlined are all key issues in obviously looking at the human rights law that applies in this area, which is what I'm going to talk about this morning. Next slide, please. So I thought before coming on to the human rights standards, it was just useful to look at the concept of climate justice as outlined in the latest IPCC report, AR6, where the IPCC has highlighted 3 principles of climate justice, which I think are very relevant to human rights norms and show the relationship between the international climate change regime, and human rights law. So the three principles they've highlighted are distributive justice, as you can see, allocation of burdens and benefits, procedural justice, who decides and participates in decision-making, and recognition, which is basic respect and robust engagement with diverse cultures and perspectives. So I'm going to focus on two areas this morning, the right to life and participation. And it's clear that climate justice is relevant to both of those areas. We can't have climate justice without procedural justice and the law, the human rights standards that go with that, or the basic respect and engagement with diverse cultures and perspectives, including those of SSF and their defenders. If we don't defend the defenders, we cannot have climate justice. So it's very clear that in law, there is an intrinsic link between human rights and climate change in the environment. This is made explicit in the Paris Agreement, in the decisions of international and domestic courts, and those of human rights bodies. They have all confirmed that human rights are critically important. So just looking, for example, at the preamble to the Paris Agreement, which you will all be familiar with, it says that parties should respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights when to address climate change. Now, it's worth remembering that this reference is to existing obligations. As my colleague has said, this may be under international law or domestic law under the Constitution to respect human rights. And what the reference in Paris does is underline that link between climate change and human rights. And also the Human Rights Committee, in addressing the right to life, specifically highlighted that environmental degradation, climate change, and unsustainable development are some of the most pressing and serious threats to the ability of future and present generations to enjoy the right to life. So again, they reiterated that clear link. So what is a human rights-based approach? We've already heard contributions on this, but the elements that I've highlighted here are that states are required to be proactive in addressing risks to life, health, and livelihood of SSF communities posed by climate change and environmental disasters. And they must do so taking into account the best available science, an approach that is underlined in the Paris Agreement. States should be transparent in doing so, and they should listen to and respond to concerns raised by SSF communities when they are drawing up policies and responses. And they are required to protect SSF communities from actions by businesses which breach their human rights. And this may arise in the context of the blue economy, as we've already heard, and in relation to adaptation plans that are not well thought out or have not been considered from the perspective of SSF communities. And importantly, states should be accountable if they do not do these things. Overall, they are meant to increase resilience and reduce vulnerability under the Paris Agreement, and they should do so consistently with their human rights obligations. As has already been mentioned, I was the co-author of a guide that has been published by UNFAO, which explores these issues in more depth. It's freely available online. You can see the link there, and hopefully this slide will be available afterwards. So the issues that I'm talking about today and other related issues are addressed in more detail in that guide. And there are lots of useful references to other primary material. So coming back to the Human Rights Committee and the right to life, this is from General Comment number 36, which deals comprehensively with the right to life, but specifically highlighted environment and climate change in a way that I think is really useful for this morning. So to start with, the right to life is a fundamental right whose effective protection is the prerequisite for the enjoyment of all other human rights. So it sits at the heart of the whole system and is obviously of particular relevance to SSF communities as they cope with extreme events, coastal inundation, and the loss of fish stocks. And it concerns the entitlement of individuals to be free from acts and omissions that may be expected to cause their unnatural or premature death. So the omission of setting up, for example, an early warning system or adequate sea defenses engages the right to life. It's not just about deliberate aggressive acts, it's about the failure to act to protect life. And the Human Rights Committee said that states should develop contingency and disaster management plans to address disasters which may adversely affect the enjoyment of the right to life. And importantly, they also said that state obligations under international environmental law, which would include the Paris Agreement, should inform the contents of the right to life, and that obligations to respect the right to life should inform their obligations under, let's say, the Paris Agreement. So that mutual link is clear in law and very important when the parties to the Paris Agreement are addressing all the issues that they have to address, whether it's loss and damage, adaptation, mitigation, or finance, or other areas. The other area I wanted to highlight this morning briefly is participation rights, which have already been mentioned, and they're obviously of central importance. The Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty has said that participation is a basic human right in itself, and it is the precondition or catalyst for the realization and enjoyment of other human rights. And colleagues have already outlined the ways in which that is completely clear from the SSF communities that they are working with. Article 7.5 of the Paris Agreement on Adaptation says that it should follow a participatory and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems. So that is clear on adaptation. Adaptation is not to be done in a top-down, non-consultative way. It should involve the communities on the front line and benefit from their knowledge and experience. The SSF guidelines that UNFAO have drawn up call for active, free, effective, meaningful, and informed participation and full and effective consultation. So these policies on climate change, food security, and so on must engage the active participation of the communities directly affected. And there is extensive human rights case law on what participation means. For example, I've put a few references there. The Budayeva case from the European Court of Human Rights in 2008 concerned loss of life due to mudslides, but the principles are generally relevant. And the court highlighted the public's right to information about risks that the authorities knew were potential risks to life, so that the failure to act was a breach of the right to life. In the Enderoy case, which concerned eviction from traditional lands, the Commission emphasized that participation should be meaningful and effective. And I think this is of central importance. Participation is not a box-ticking exercise. It is the active engagement with the views of the community concerned, who are often best placed to understand the threats to their lives from changing conditions on the ground. And that is at the heart of this right of participation. Governments must hear those views, understand them, and respond adequately. And again, in this Ogoniland case, obviously different context, but the same principle. It was said that in relation to the rights to health and environment, obviously also relevant here, communities must be provided with meaningful opportunities to be heard and participate in development decisions. So those and many other cases have underlined the central importance of the right. It's not a privilege, it's a right to participation. And I think this raises a series of questions for SSF communities and for the parties to the Paris Agreement more broadly when looking at action taken under the climate change regime. Has the state acted proactively to protect the right to life of SSF communities from the risks that we've already heard about, those of extreme weather events, the movement of fish stocks affecting food security and resulting in the need for much riskier fishing practices in small vessels, for example? Does the state adopt a human rights-based approach? Has it clearly identified SSF right holders, assessed the human rights impact of proposed policies on livelihoods or on the blue economy, for example? Does it adopt inclusive and non-discriminatory governance models, taking into account the representation of women and other ethnically marginalized groups, older people, disabled people, and so on? And in relation to maladaptation, adaptation that doesn't achieve protection for affected communities, have policies been subject to impact assessment? And has there been a proper consultation and right to respond by SSF communities? And importantly, what access to justice do those communities have when things go wrong or where it appears as though they might do? For example, where it's clear that early warning systems are not adequate to the kinds of risks they are facing. So I just want to finish with a proposal, which is that I think, and this could apply to a range of rights, but I've focused on the right to life. I think in order to make sure that things are working on the ground, it is useful to have a right to life audit at the national level for the relevant authorities and affected communities to consider together all the ways in which state authorities, agencies, and communities can address the right to life together, and to see where states are fulfilling the right to life adequately or not. I also think this should be part of the global stocktake, that in looking at everything in the round, it's important to see what works in climate change action and what doesn't, to look at human rights and to see where the international community is, and importantly, where finance is going. Our country is unable to act because they simply don't have the financial resources to allow people to change livelihoods or to put in place early warning systems. Are donor countries complying with their financial obligations under Paris to ensure that finance flows promote climate resilient development? For example, those are all key issues, whether we're talking about mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage. And finally, I just want to highlight the right to life of environmental and human rights defenders. As we saw at the beginning, basic respect is a feature of climate justice. And in my view, from a legal perspective, there can be no climate justice without the adequate protection and respect of all environmental and human rights defenders, wherever they may be. And harassment of defenders is not consistent with climate justice. And I will finish on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that very educated presentation. Our next presentation will be given by Ms. Stefania Tripodi. Ms. Stefania Tripodi is also a lawyer, specializing in human rights at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. She focuses on economic, social, and cultural rights, and in particular, the right to food and the right to social protection, providing support to states, civil society, and other UN agencies in translating human rights norms and principles into concrete principles at national and international level. Before joining the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, Stefania worked as a researcher for the former Special Rapporteur on the right to health or hunt at the University of Essex, and for the London-based NGO Minority Rights Group, and she has also volunteered in Venezuela for the NGO Provia. And so she's got extensive experience both within the UN bodies as well as from the perspective of civil society organizations. Stefania, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bolanli, for this generous introduction. I would like to thank One Ocean Hub for organizing this timely discussion in the context of COP27. It is a real pleasure to be here with you today. In today's focus on fostering international cooperation to protect the human rights of small-scale fishers is a crucial one. As we have seen in the previous presentation, fish is a key global source of food and nutritional security. It ensures a livelihood for some almost 60 million people and builds the backbone of the socioeconomic well-being of fisher communities around the world. But small-scale fishers and their communities often remain invisible, and climate change, discrimination, and marginalization all intersect to threaten their basic rights. From insecure land tenure, unequal access to water and marine resources, lack of access to healthcare, education, social protection, and adequate food, abusive and exploitative working conditions, these are just some of their daily realities. And women fishers in particular bear the brunt of discrimination and marginalization. They comprise half of the global fisheries workforce and yet have less access to resources and services. And they're more likely to be excluded from leadership and decision-making positions. Often their tasks are unrecognized and underpaid, and they are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. Their legal rights are often threatened in case of divorce, death, or remarriage of their spouse. And these rights violations extend to impact not only women themselves, but also the well-being and survival of their families and children. And on the top of these challenges, climate change, including increased floods and droughts and irregular rainfall and extreme weather events, poses enormous risks for small-scale fishers. As we have seen in the previous presentation, the warming of the oceans, the movement of fish stocks have the potential to disrupt economies, displace communities, bring about conflicts, and amplify threats for the regions of the world who rely heavily upon fishing as a vital sector of their economy. In the Pacific, for example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights documented how small-scale fishers' rights, including their right to work, has been affected by rising sea levels, extreme weather, overfishing from vessels outside the region, and non-sustainable tourist and development projects. In Africa Sahel, in San Luis region of Senegal, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported that fishers increasingly have no choice but to seasonally migrate to Mauritania, where fish stocks are less depleted and where there are more work opportunities. So in the face of these challenges, small-scale fishers require special protection and measure to safeguard their access to coastal waters and fishing grounds. And also, as Kate has pointed out, international human rights law provides a solid framework to devise legal and policy measures to address these challenges. From the Universal Declaration on Human Rights to the 9 core human rights instruments that goes from racial discrimination to the rights of the child, to civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, they all apply to small-scale fishers. And they help into bringing a magnifier lens to spot the root causes of discrimination and provide policy guidance to eradicate discrimination and promote substantive equality, including in climate action. Each of these instruments has a monitoring body that has an authoritative role in interpreting the rights and the obligations of the different instruments. They monitor the implementation of the instrument at country level, providing key recommendations to the state. And in certain cases, they can also receive individual complaints. And the recommendations in particular, the concluding observations of national reports, provide sometimes a contextualized roadmap for advancing the enjoyment of small-scale fishers' rights. Furthermore, 3 years ago, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas that specifically includes small-scale fishers. And overall, this body of law, what it does is that it calls for targeted measures to support small-scale fishers with financial support, access to credit, land, seeds, natural resources, and technology to support their livelihood, their decent working conditions, and sustainable fishing. It also calls for dismantling deep-rooted and intersecting forms of discrimination, including gender and racial discrimination, that hinder small-scale fishers' rights. And also they call for empowering small-scale fishers to ensure their participation in policy and decision-making processes affecting them, in having access to information, accountable processes, and remedies in case of violations. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is anchored in human rights and is also a key tool to advance the human rights of small-scale fishers. States have a responsibility to reach those who have been left furthest behind and make them protagonists of the most important goals of our generation. To achieve the goals of zero hunger, gender equality, fighting climate change, protecting biodiversity, the full and meaningful participation of small-scale fishers must be guaranteed. And also, as Kate and the previous speakers have pointed out, the right to participation in all decision-making is key, as these decisions can affect the lives, lands, and livelihood of small-scale fishers. and strong and independent organization of small-scale fishers should be respected and encouraged by states, and will also be crucial in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights collaborates in a constant manner with FAO. In the context of the Committee on World Food Security, we have been raising awareness on the need to apply human rights-based approach in implementing the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. And we have promoted, together with FAO and One Ocean Hub, events to provide a space for small-scale fishers to bring their views and perspective and help shape policy making. In fact, devising effective climate adaptation measures require governments to recognize the structural factors that deepen small-scale fishers' climate vulnerability. And so it's essential that governments involve small-scale fishers in seeking solutions and dedicate resources to upholding their rights, including equitable and improved access to land, natural resources, education, information, and social protection. I hope that this brief overview was helpful in highlighting some of the crucial elements the human rights framework brings to the protection of small-scale fishers and in highlighting ongoing collaboration on this topic. So I thank you for your attention and I look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania, for that presentation. And yes, it was very clear some of the challenges around small-scale fishers, but of course what the United Nations, the Office of the High Commissioner is doing in that context. So thank you very much. If there are any questions for any of the presenters, please put them in the Q&A section and we would either answer them live or we will answer them within the space. So please, if you've got any questions, please do that in the Q&A section. Our next presentation is from Dr. Su-Young Huang. Dr. Su-Young Huang is a legal officer with the UN Environment Programme, where she works on the advancement and implementation of environmental rule of law and environmental rights. Prior to joining UNEP, she worked with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as well, where she worked on economic, social, and environmental issues. She has a PhD in international relations, specializing in states' compliance with international law and norms. Dr. Su-Young Huang will be talking to us about the implementation of the right to a healthy environment for people and the planet. Dr. Su-Young.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Nairobi. I hope everybody's well. And so I'm very happy to be presenting at this very important event. So, and I also wanted to appreciate the One Ocean Hub and all the partners for actually working on this important issue on small fisheries, because it's also an issue that's been less understood than other issues on climate change and other human rights issues related to land defenders and other issues. So ocean is really an issue that I think is really, really important to small fisheries as well. So thank you for really bringing this issue into the attention of everybody. So today, I heard a great presentation from the national experiences and also the human rights laws and also the UN level cooperations and efforts in this regard. So today I just wanted to introduce you a new development in this area that might be very helpful for the rights of the for guaranteeing the rights of the small fisheries, but also the preventing the further environmental degradation for oceans and other areas. So the great news is we have a lot of human rights laws and human rights standards, but a new right, a right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment has been recognized as an independent right by the General Assembly in July this year. So which is a huge deal because they do not recognize a new right every day or every year. It's been actually, it's the first time since the GA recognized a right to water in 2010. So it's a really a big deal, and it's also an effort of a lot of like different stakeholders, states and the CSOs and indigenous peoples and children and youth, and including a lot of indigenous peoples working in the oceans as well. So what does this mean for like the small fisheries? So the implication of this will be it'll be quite huge for the small fisheries in a way, because we talk about right to food and right to participation and all these things. But the right to healthy environment will be a bit more broad, and also will be protecting the rights of the small fisheries, including especially for those who are more vulnerable to environmental and climate degradation, so such as indigenous peoples, meaning also the coastal communities and the small fisheries. So like the right is fundamentally paying more attention to those people who are in vulnerable situations. So it will be having a huge impact on this the small fisheries as well, in a way that is in a way that we're achieving the climate justice and environmental justice for all. And in terms of the substantive elements of the right to healthy environment, which is still being developed because it's a new right, and the rights actually develop. They tend to continue to develop. But one of the common understanding that we have is actually the sustainable production and consumption of food, is recognized or is regarded as one of the components of the right to healthy environment. And for this, the small fisheries have a huge role in this. One, as a rights holder, and the right to food and the right to livelihood, but also as an affected group, as I mentioned, as a more disproportionately affected group to climate change and other environmental degradation, and also as agents of change. They are actually not just working for themselves, but also they are the ones on the front line, actually protecting our right to food and also protecting our environment, because their use of fisheries are more sustainable and more traditional, knowledge-based, and more environmentally friendly. So there are a lot of aspects of the small fisheries are related to the right to healthy environment, and also the sustainable, one of the components of the right to healthy environment, which is sustainable production and consumption. And so where we are standing is, the right was adopted, just recognized and adopted by the GA through the GA resolution in July this year, which was a few months back. And at the moment, we are working really hard, is also with the One Ocean Hub partnership with the One Ocean Hub, is to really raise awareness about this right, and also like making sure like how do we understand this right. You know, we need a common understanding without limiting the scope and the potential of the right, because it has so much potential. And so one is that, and second is the implementation. So we are working towards the implementation guideline, how this right can be implemented for the rights holders, the different types of rights holders, including small fisheries, and also the people who are working on food issues, and also different stakeholders, children and youth, and also the future generations as well. And third, the ways forward is the obligations for states. And how can we clarify the obligations, and what kind of obligations are rising from this newly recognized right, and how can people actually like enjoy the right through the through making sure that the states actually meet their obligations. And also one of the key really important issue in the fisheries, small fisheries in oceans, is really the business activities, as a lot of you will agree. So we're also looking into how the right to healthy environment will be applied for the business activities, and how that can interplay with the UN guiding principle on business and human rights. So this is another area that we're really looking into, which I think will have a huge impact on the small fisheries, especially with a lot of industrial fisheries are taking over, and either affecting the livelihood of small fishers, or the pushing them further away from their livelihoods. And fourth, I wanted to mention the balance between the environmental protection and also climate actions, and also the human rights, the realization of human rights, because they don't always coincide. So we've seen cases how the human rights, the climate mitigation adaptation projects could actually affect adversely affect the rights holders, including the indigenous peoples and local communities, and also as well as the coastal communities. So this will be actually, we'll have to really like find a good balance between the environmental protection activities, as well as like to make sure that does not violate human rights or does not that to the abuses of human rights, but they make sure that they are sustainable and balanced and they're coherent in the way that it meets the environmental obligations, but also human rights obligations. So these are a few ways for that UNEP is working on with many partners, and including the OHCHR and the UNDP and also CSOs and the One Ocean Hub. So I will stop here and we'll be happy to answer any questions related to this. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. for that insight into implementing the right to healthy environment. Our last presentation for this session, it will be by Mr. Herman Honeb. Mr. Herman Honeb is the director of the Hanganeni Artisanal Fishing Association in Namibia. He was brought up by a small-scale fisher grandfather in Chutate Mukuve in Swakopmund. Apologies, I'm sure I murdered that. And he experienced exciting lifestyles along the coastal towns. And of course, in his position as the director of the Hanganeni Artisanal Fishing Association, he is representative, or he will be able to speak specifically to some of the challenges as well as the experience of artisanal fishers in Namibia. Mr. Herman Honeb, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lanley, and of course, the rest of the participants in this important event. Having listened to the previous speakers, it certainly makes me to rethink what exactly I should share with you, as it is primarily looking at the human rights issues, of course, of which we have also gone through some dynamics within our country and within the organizational development as well. So here and there, I will definitely touch on some of the issues related definitely to the human rights aspects. I may not follow the exact sequence of the overview of the presentation simply because of the time, and as well as wanting to put emphasis on something more relevant for this particular discussions. But I've got 7 key aspects that I wanted to address. Some of them I will simply run through very quickly. Here, as a prelude to my presentation, I think it is very important for us to share this slide, because we regard ourselves as small-scale fishers, but we have seen it is our right to get engaged with big industry guys as well. And this slide depicts the fact that we have fostered a very sound working relationship with a bigger company called Tunagor that translated into complementing each other and supporting each other in terms of institutional needs and so on. So you can see there is a ministry official there, there is a Tunagor management there, and they have Hanganeni additional fishers management there. And there are fishers, small-scale fishers themselves, and we are trying by all means to involve women. This picture is actually to showcase that there is a need for coexistence between what we will term as big guys and us small fishers. And I would also want to share with you, through this picture, a very interesting history of the vessel that you see there. Hanganeni, the word Hanganeni means together. We need to be together, basically, for us to achieve or understand the dynamics of the industry in which we find ourselves, and of course, to come up with common needs, aspirations, and common activities. The story of Hanganeni is that the vessel was built in the early or late 50s in Lüderitz in Namibia. It's a wood vessel, and as small-scale fishers, having experienced that onshore fishing is becoming a challenge by day because of the climate change and because of overfishing, and we thought, let's try to get a bigger vessel or a vessel to get into the offshore activities as well, to see what it means. And the vessel was initially called Dan Viljoen. I guess this was some of our colonial masters. The vessel, the picture should also depict that we are really taking the challenge of getting into the bigger industry gradually, to know whether indeed the climate change is having a serious impact also in the offshore, and why the bigger industry guys should be continuing exploiting the resource while we are understanding that there is no resources. So this picture is basically telling us to take the challenge and to understand the broader industry. Okay, then I'll start off with the brief history of Hanganeni, how it all started. Hanganeni was established because of the illegal fishing that was termed as illegal fishing by the apartheid system or regime. Most of our small-scale fishers did not have the necessary permits, nor required support to participate in legal fishing and trading, and by so doing, the people who were living from the fishery resources, catching fish, were actually arrested and fined, and this was a vicious cycle. Every time they will be arrested, they will be fined, they will come back and catch fish to pay their fines. So it was quite a serious challenge eventually for the current government after independence, and that's when the new independent government actually organized small-scale fishers into a structure today known as HAFA, Hanganeni Artisanal Fishing Association. Now, from this humble beginning, as an informal setup, we became a formal organization, and we did an institutional assessment. We looked at certain policies and systems, and we looked at longer-term planning processes. And as we are speaking now, through a number of interventions, we are now reviewing our model to come up with a new business model that will be sustainable, that will look at different aspects of getting involved in the sustainable utilization of the fishery and marine resources. Some of our business operations and activities include onshore fishing. That means our small-scale fishers are going out to the sea. They catch fish. They bring to the facility, to the processing facility where they are being weighed. The data stats are recorded, and they are being paid at the end of the week, after or even before the fish are sold. And because our facility is processing, adding value, and they are putting a small markup to selling fish, and so to support the fishers. However, this is increasingly becoming a challenge because of the decreasing stocks. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we started embarking on offshore activities whereby we got a ski boat and a vessel, and 3 licenses that that allows us to partner with bigger guys. Our headquarters is based in Hendy's Bay, where we have got a processing facility. And once we process our fish and package, and then we market them locally, mainly locally and nationally, basically. We have got an infrastructure that I will share with you through the pictures. Our membership is growing gradually. We've divided the membership into 2. Those that are more or less permanent or full members that are taking participating in the daily activities every day, and those that are associate members that buys into the objectives of HAFA. And that means we have now expanded also to Swakop and Walvis Bay, and we are looking at Luderitz as well, but we've only formed task forces within these coastal towns to continue with the consultations to come up with area-specific programs or activities. Our vision is that we have a well-governed and managed organization for the betterment of the lives of the small-scale fishers within a safe and conducive legal framework. HAFA is to be seen as a vehicle to drive the aspirations of the small-scale fishers, whether it is catching fish or whether it is advocating on their or with them or for them. Our mission is basically to improve small-scale fishers' resilience at the ocean climate nexus as the talk of the day. We got involved with the climate change because of the BCC support that resulted in a vulnerability or rapid vulnerability assessment report that highlighted few things that we considered as challenges or as threats. The Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources is the key stakeholder or the custodian that has helped forming Anganeni Additional Fishing Association. Therefore, its delegate is sitting in our board, plus the local authority representative and UNAM representative, including Hendy's Bay municipality, meaning local authorities where we are to operate should be represented in such a structure, including residents rep or community rep of that particular area, as well as Namibia Fish Consumption and the National Planning Commission. Those are some of the representatives in the board. But most importantly, the fishers are having their structure in place from where they are delegating a representative to the board. From around 140 fishing members, they've got a fishers committee, and from the fishers committee, they are delegating a member to serve in the board, and to maintain transparency and to maintain the level of ownership of the organization. The same structure or representative serves also in the management issues of the organization. Now you would see under the management, under the board, we have got an executive committee. Under the executive committee, we have a director, and then we've got 2 senior colleagues that are one accountant and the business development officer, and then we've got the rest of the staff members. Some of the milestones is that we continue to improve on the good governance, whereby we ensure meaningful involvement and empowerment of the small-scale fishers. We have a constitution, and the organization is registered. We've developed in terms of management, we increasing in professional development of the organization. We developed some policies, relevant policies, and we continue to develop on some policies as well as internal control systems. Of course, we have maintained that sound working relationship with the ministry, or generally with the government through the Ministry of Fisheries, and therefore we are being supported through a quota. That's on this slide. That's basically. Of course, we also believe in critical partnership, because we have noticed that with the bigger partnerships, actually we can, in development partners, we can reach our ultimate goals as small-scale fishers.
Mr. Hannep, just to point out, just a few more minutes to the end of the session. So if you highlight the most important points, so we can start to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. We can now run to the slides. Now this slide has been dealt with already. We can move on. Okay, these are just some of our scapegoats. We can all continue moving on. Maybe in this slides are just, this was our first scapegoat that we rebuilt, and we had a very nasty experience with a wrong partnership, but at least now we have fostered a good relationship with another partner. We are engaging the bigger industry colleagues to share their skills and support in revamping our vessel. That's where we were rebuilding our old vessel that was called Dan Balloon and renamed as Hanganeni. Yeah, that's when it was almost rebuilt down, almost ready for catching fish. We have also started building a fish shop. Yeah, and those are just fish shops that we have built. This slide simply reflects our involvement in social responsibility with our fishers. That simply depicts how our revenues are apportioned. This is how we are marketing our products. Now, as wrap up, I would just simply, okay, we are also involving our young people to provide advice, training, and blue economy opportunities.
Unfortunately, the session will end at the half an hour's mark, and I don't want for it to be cut off without saying a big thank you first to the panelists as well as the participants. I should say that we will have copies, Senia, if I'm correct, of the slides uploaded to our pages. We unfortunately do not have the time to listen to the chief fisherman from Ghana as well, but that will also be uploaded to our YouTube page as well as the other video clip as well, which we got from the Namibian experience as well. Like I said, I'd like to thank everyone who has joined the session. Thank you very much to all the panelists who have taken their time out of their very busy schedule. And I am aware that this time of the year, particularly around climate, the COP conference is a very busy time for many of our panelists. So I'm very grateful to them on behalf of the Hub. We say a big thank you, as well as to all of the participants. All of the information can be found on our website, as well as on our YouTube channel. And of course, we will welcome communication. If there are any questions which we have missed answering, please send us an email and we will make an attempt to get back to you. Thank you very much to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.